So when we look at Paralandra, one of the things that is very clear throughout it is that it's trying to ask the question, it's actually a very interesting question, of what was lost in the fall. And I don't think there is enough of a reflection on that piece. It goes back to something I was saying at a previous lecture, which is the Bible does not begin with the fall, it begins with creation. Now, very quickly the fall is introduced, but we have to you do not understand the fall without a really hefty, incredibly rich understanding of creation. Which means that a Christian should enjoy creation to the fullest. If you're an outdoorsy person, you should completely embrace that. If you're indoorsy, that's good too. That's what I am. Read some books. No, I'm just kidding. But whatever it is that gives you joy, whatever it is that you find in this world where you find those little shafts of light, of joy and pleasure and the wonderful things, I do find in the modern evangelical mind that there is always some guilt associated with that. This idea that, you go on a nice vacation, you spend too much time with family. There's this, those of you who have ever worked in youth ministry, you sometimes hear this. It's like, well, I love my girlfriend or I love my boyfriend, but I kind of feel like it's getting in the way of my love of Jesus. And they have this sort of subtle, misaligned guilt that as if God wants them to be unhappy to be, fully in relationship with Him. And this idea that we don't, I don't think, understand fully the joys of creation. But that is what Paralandra does bring out, because it puts you in an Eden sort of context, is what did we lose? Creation didn't become shattered and us being the image of God, we didn't lose that. What happened is the good creation became marred. It became corrupted because of it. But it's only, I would say this, put it this way, sin is only really big, really serious when you take into account what it affects. Sin is only considered to be heinous and so rebellious against God when you take into account the goodness of creation that destroyed it or corrupted it. God is jealous of us, the Bible says, and He hates the sin that is corrupting us, not because He's mad at us for having it, but because of the good creation that we were when that should not have had it. He does not want these things, and so what I always say, if you have the most aggressive understanding of God's good creation and also sin, you don't diminish sin. In other words, to take sin correctly, you don't diminish it and elevate creation. Rather, you bring creation up in your mind to be just as important as the doctrine of sin. And when you have that strong doctrine of creation, I think where Lewis is taking us, you don't then become anti the world in the fullest sense. I always say, and when I was doing this UNF thing on science and religion and on the origins, I said, Christians are not anti-science. God created the world. We love studying it. Christians are not anti-literature. We're not anti-poetry. We're not anti-philosophy. We're not anti all of these things. What we're opposed to is sin's corrupting influence that has affected all of these things. So we expect sin to be everywhere, but we also expect there to be good things, joy, truth, and things that we can learn out there. So if my daughter, as she goes up through, and my son, as they grow up through school, as they learn things, when I go home, there's always something she's telling me. Daddy, look what I found on YouTube. She's always looking for, her new big thing is volcanoes. She loves volcanoes. She just finds it crazy that this piece of the earth opens up and this lava comes out. And then she goes, can I go there? And I said, probably not, But nonetheless, at the end of it, she's just always enthralled by creation. And I always find a bit of what Lewis is kind of getting at, this childlike wonder at it should be ours. Stop acting mature by acting unimpressed. You don't need to be unimpressed with creation. You need to be, as Chesterton says in that quote I read in a previous lecture, you need to be completely monotonously strong in saying, this is awesome at all times. It's the same thing whenever we experience love in our life. Love, and this is, we're not reading the Four Loves, but a good book to follow up the fiction on is Four Loves by Lewis, where he talks about all of the varieties of love that God has given us. And what he ends up saying is all of these loves are not mutually contradictory, but there is one supreme love that gives us the best understanding of all the others, and that is the love of God, the divine love. It's called agape love. And he says, if you have that love in proper perspective, all of the other loves, brotherly love, eros, erotic, or spousal love, all these other loves become then perfect and wonderful because they are subsumed under God's love, under the proper order. And just as creation is the thing that is the thing that gives us the most joy, so also the sin that has corrupted it ends up actually making us more upset. Speaking of the little ones. But that being said, creation, in other words, is the thing we have to hold in high regard. And I think that's where Paralandra puts us. Paralandra tells us this is the world we lost. This is the world that should have been, and therefore it is the world that we should cherish. And therefore, because it is Edenic, sin actually should make us all the more upset. We should hate it all the more because we actually understand what was lost in that created order. All right, third and last book is That Hideous Strength. Now, I've already said that Hideous Strength is not an easy read. I think that it's not an easy read literarily. I think what Lewis is doing, though, is some interesting things theologically. But I'll just go ahead and warn you, if you haven't read it, the first third to half is not easy in terms of the plot. You kind of feel like, where's this going? What's going on? Why is he so mad that they're selling trees? You know, this kind of a thing. And there's this kind of, honestly, I find Lewis to be a little bit snarky. He's kind of mad at colleges at Oxford who are selling themselves off. Whether or not you like it or not, the central conceit of the entire book is the assault, the final full assault of the satanic forces on the created order. So it's all about the full sort of exposure of that power machine, that mad with power, drunk with power concept, that here is evil trying to conquer. So in other words, we've looked at a few times at how Lewis talks about veiled sin, veiled threats by the enemy. How sometimes, we talked about screw tape, that sometimes the satanic forces actually want to convince us that they don't exist because then they still won. Because if they don't exist, then God doesn't exist, and they become a rationalist. But actually in this book, in That Hideous Strength, even by the name, in this sort of dystopian sense, suddenly the mask is off and the evil forces are moving in at a very, a strong rate. Yeah. I think he does bring in many of the same themes and weaves them in, yes. Magician's Nephew in particular has particularly some of these elements, but even throughout the Narnia series, Lewis's depiction of evil usually has two foci. It's either, no, it's not, I'm not evil, I just have some Turkish delight. It's this kind of veiled Satan hiding himself in the guise of good things. And there's the other of sort of unmasked sort of aggression and really pretty serious things. And so at the end of it, Lewis, I think, has those two focal points. Tolkien's, I think, is a bit more nuanced. We'll get into that in the next weekend, in the next several lectures. But that being said, for Lewis, yes, I do think in the Narnia series there's that same pattern of sometimes it's, no, I'm not evil, I'm good, I'm on your side, have some Turkish delight again. And other times it's just it's full-throated scream of evil kind of a thing. And people actually get freaked out by Lewis a few times. In his own day, there were readers who thought he was kind of twisted at times. And I think it sort of proves the point about the modernistic Enlightenment world. They thought he was twisted because he took evil so seriously. And he just doesn't apologize for it. He says, evil is serious. And it's not just serious in the guise of Hitler. It's serious in our everyday world as well. And there is something going on in this day and age, that day and age, I should say, World War I and II time, where they do, actually I could say it's going on today in some ways as well, but where we tend to put the focus of evil on that group or that person or that thing. We localize evil as something. So in our political arena, it becomes, this party thinks that party is evil, or vice versa, or that enemy overseas is evil. And this happens throughout history. I'm not talking necessarily about now. I think in the Christian world, it becomes even more pervasive, though, where churches or denominations find that one thing is what's killing us. If only we attack that one culture war issue, or if only we attack that one book that we don't like, or that one speaker that has said something wrong, that we will then somehow cleanse everyone of evil. Now that being said, we should still be on the fight. We should still be strong in our convictions, and we should still call things wrong when they're wrong. I'm not saying we stop doing certain things. But it's kind of like the devil will get you model. It's the one thing. If we just kind of stay away from wine, women, and song, then suddenly we will have cleansed ourselves in this kind of idea. And it's a false sanctification, to put words in Lewis's mouth. It's a false sanctification to hate something and then distance yourself from it, in that Pharisaical sense, and say, "Phew, I'm glad I'm not like that person," or "I don't have that in my life," or "I didn't read that book, so I'm better than them." And what Lewis will always do is he'll nuance and massage evil, and in particular, he'll show how every single one of us has that propensity to twist. And this will be very, very evident when you read Till We Have Faces, and we're going to get to that in another lecture, but I'll say it now. Till We Have Faces is a profoundly, I think, it's literally, in my mind, Lewis's best book ever, out of all of them. Lewis himself said he thinks it's his best book out of all of them. So I'm just agreeing with him. But in Till We Have Faces, it's very interesting. It's this story of Cupid and Psyche, and I'll get into that later. But what happens is Lewis takes this traditional story of two figures that fall in love, and then they have a breaking of the relationship, and then they come back together. That's the basic part of the story. And he doesn't tell it from their perspective. He tells it from the ugly sister perspective, the ugly older sister in this story. And the entire story is told from her vantage point. And it is a remarkable book because throughout it, it is very clear that we are her. We are not the perfect one. We are not the godlike figure. We witness that love in its own way. But rather, we see this sort of poisonous mind in this book where she is blaming God for everything, and her sister should love her and not go marry this person. It's this kind of tortured self-aggrandizing pity, you might say. And Lewis actually puts us in her eyes, puts us in her mind's eye. And he basically, by the end of the book, you can basically see he's saying, we are her. We do this to everything. We try to dominate. We try to love something to death in a metaphorical sense. The helicopter parent in all of us. We try to do too much for our kids, and by doing so, push them away and do worse on them. Or the experience of a jolted lover, or someone who has a fight with their spouse or their friend, and they ruin the relationship because of it. Because how dare you do that to me? All the brokenness in our relationships, Lewis will say, is done because of what happened in this book. So when you get to Till We Have Faces, Lewis his understanding of sin really comes out in that book, and it's specifically saying, we sin not by always doing the worst possible thing, but often by doing the little things over and over again, or by doing the right thing in a way that is so selfish that we've even perverted the right thing. Pharisaism, that kind of thing. The elder brother versus the prodigal son, as Christ tells us. So that hideous strength, it comes out of World War II. What's funny is the book actually has a subtitle. It's called A Modern Fairy Tale for Grown-Ups. And I do think it's a little bit opaque, but I think there's something going on here. What we do know is it's pretty much the Tower of Babel story sort of retold. And there's some evidence of this in Lewis's letters and some of the things he says, and by some of the experts, on Lewis who have read the book. But essentially what happens is the forces of Satan unfurl themselves and try to build this sort of empire unto themselves. And the idea is that there's just no way they're going to be able to accomplish this, and that the forces of good, of God, are also marshaling themselves to put a stop to this. And so the end of this book, the sort of central core of it, is this idea of the futility of our attempt to own and to oppress and to create things. Again, you see the concept of nature. You see the idea that there is God's good creation, and we would rather destroy it to build our own empires than to cherish it and enjoy it on its own. Again, he's not a tree hugger. He's not doing this for the sake of creation worship. What he's saying is rather to destroy it to build our own empires is self-worship. And rather, if we had loved God, we might have not worshipped self, and we might not have tried to build our empires and destroyed earth as a result. So there's some perception here. I do think, by the way, it's perceptive. I will put it this way: it's perceptive in the sense that what he's saying is that, in essence, what is on the horizon in human history, he thinks, is the ongoing, unstoppable force of progress that destroys things. Now, to say this in 1945, I think is pretty perceptive. Now, he has seen the Industrial Revolution and some things, but to see, I mean, he died in 1964. I don't know if you know this, but actually, here's a little pop quiz. Do you know why no one noticed that he died? JFK died, yeah. JFK was assassinated the day he died, so literally it's like there's a little small thing on the New York Times page, but no one seemed to notice it because the whole world was paying attention to Texas. But that being said, that he died in the 60s, but he wrote this in the 40s, but to see where we have gone since is actually, I mean, there's a prophecy element to what he's saying here. I'm not saying he's a prophet, but he does see where we're going. He does see that, as he says, we have no virtue. We have nothing that's holding us back from the excesses of where our hearts and minds and sin will take us. So as power and technology increases, we're only going to be more powerful at what we're able to do to ourselves and to the world. And so, again, I find this to be pretty dramatic. I don't know what the answer is in our culture, because Lewis doesn't either. And at the end of the day, Lewis's answer really is simply just to be faithful, to be a faithful follower, to be a Christian. But at the end of it, there's not a lot that can be. In other words, you can't go back to before the Western world lost its soul. You can't take people who have sort of tasted of this kind of pretty extraordinary excess and say, hey, do you want to go back to the Victorian age and kind of hold back and everything and be a moral pagan? The answer is generally no. And so where we've come in the 21st century is really kind of the full end of what Lewis and others were talking about. Now, he's not fully skeptical. Christ is still on the throne. It's still his world. But what we're dealing with now is some pretty extraordinarily interesting times where our technology and our power can really leverage our sin in a way it could not before. The ability to do things to break down marriages, break down friendships, corrupt the church, to insinuate really bad ideas into the minds of innocent lay Christians, it is a hard task to fight against if you're going into ministry. Students of early church history are often surprised by how authoritarian it is in the early days. Well, you had to be authoritarian, I would say, in those days because a lot of the ideas were sort of swirling around, and the bishops would say, look, I only get to talk to you every now and again. If you go out there and someone gives you a bad philosophy, don't listen to them. Come talk to your bishop. This kind of a very hierarchical model. I don't think we need to go there now with our world. But we're in that same kind of world where the people in your ministries are going to be exposed to more and worse and more frequently corrupting influences and things than ever could be before. Now, the good thing I will say is this. It also means more people are aware of how corrupt and sinful the world is than they ever were before. Try to convince someone in the Victorian era that the world is sinful and evil and going to hell in a handbasket, and they're going to say, really? No, it's good. We're moral, we're strong, we are here, and this is awesome. What's interesting, I like the history of modern music a little bit. I look at it, I study it a little bit. It never ceases to amaze me that people who are into heavy metal, the kind of really sort of dark theme stuff, there's always people that convert from that world. They'd be like a satanic band, and suddenly they're like a preacher. And you're just like, what happened there? And I actually I was talking with another seminary prof one time about it who had shared similar sort of interests. And he goes, well, it's easy to convert someone in that world. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, they're already rebelling against the heinousness of the unjustness of the world. They're screaming all that stuff very often because they're sick of the sin of the world. They won't call it that. He goes, but they at least know the diagnosis of what's real out there. He says they're not self-aggrandizing, all this kind of stuff. All that to say, he says, you can then at the end give someone the cure when they know the problem. I think that's there's an analogy there to what our culture is. I have a lot of sort of connection with people in youth ministry, a lot of friends in that world, and I say, what's it like when we were in youth ministry as youth and now? And they said, kids in youth ministry today usually are not, you don't have to convince them very much that there's a lot of sin out there. They see it more. They're exposed to things sooner. They see the corruption of things. And it's not just drugs and things, but they are aware of what's going on, even just around the world. I mean, I grew up, literally the craziest thing that happened in my life that we were all aware of was the O.J. Simpson trial when I was in high school. And we were all kind of glued to the TV. Other than that, I was blissfully ignorant of anything happening anywhere in the world. And a friend of mine in youth ministry said, youth today know what's going on in the world, and they see school shootings, they see wars, they see famine, they're more aware of the problems that are going on out there than we were. And so therefore, ministering to them and getting their eyes open to the world is actually a good challenge, and it's actually something we can do today. Now, again, every strength has a weakness. The more they're exposed, the more they're vulnerable, but also the more they are able to understand the cost of their decisions. Did I see a hand?
No, that's interesting, like the Terminator movies.
Oh, is that right? What is it? The singularity, the time when AI finally happens and it has self-consciousness. Yeah, no, it is kind of funky. The comment there was about Stephen Hawking and the future of where tech will go, and artificial intelligence and these kinds of things. I do find it funny. Stephen Hawking, he lives in Cambridge, and you see him often wheeling around town. And what's funny is, I mean, he it wasn't that long ago when he was. He wouldn't say some of these things, but increasingly him and other scientists are just saying kind of sci-fi level stuff. He wouldn't go on to say Terminator, but... No, but he's saying artificial intelligence, and eventually, there are a lot of people that are talking about eventually robots will take over the world, and our biology will meld with... it's sort of straight out of sci-fi kind of stuff. And I don't know how much... I don't know enough about that to know what specifically they're referring to. But... It does. I do think one of the new challenges. I'll put it this way. I'll put it in the form of a story. At one of our faculty retreats at the main campus, we invited like 4 or 5 pastors to come in, and they had decades of experience, and it was sort of a Q&A, and the faculty just were asking questions like, so what if we send someone out from here to your church, what are they missing that we should have in our curriculum or should be focusing on now that is now the biggest thing? And I remember this one pastor, actually he's from Jacksonville, but he lives in Boston now, so he was talking to me afterwards. But he said on the stage, he said, you could teach 6 courses on ethics and still not cover all the things that are just careening into our world right now. Bioethics, sexual ethics, ethics of technology, ethics of reproduction, all these steps. And he says there is just simply not enough time to keep up with things. You can literally teach an ethics course on some of these things now, and the next semester it's already beginning to become obsolete in some level. Now, not fully. I mean, it's not that fast, but the speed with which we are developing things is a blessing. We have a blessing of like things like health, things like the ability to diagnose and treat things. Absolutely a blessing from God. But we are seeing things change so rapidly in our culture. This pastor said. He said, I needed one ethics course in seminary. He said, we had to talk about the big issues of the day. He says, now we could do 6, and you're still not necessarily up to speed. And I think he's right on some level, at least in terms of engaging with it. Which I don't teach ethics, but I teach things like this, which is why I have brought this element in. You have to be aware of where power will take us. And technology and the way the modern world will advance will always either excite some of our sinful elements, or it'll tamp down the good elements, the sanctified elements of us. Now, again, I'm not being a pessimist here about where the world's going, but I am saying that these are the things that Christians need to be thinking on, particularly in the churches. The question is, do we have any personal notes or any inside knowledge as to what he was doing when he was creating the book? The answer is no, and he doesn't give us a whole lot. I mean, we have some. We have letters. We have some of his journal, but there are periods, even in his journal, he may not be telling us what he's thinking, that kind of a thing. But the short answer is he doesn't give us a ton of information. Now, he gives us some, but not too much more than what I've already been talking about. And so, I would say a charitable reading is, well, I'll put it this way. That Hideous Strength, because the whole beginning is about an English college that is kind of succumbing to the pressure of the satanic force, it feels like a hokey move at this day and age. It's like, what? This college. I do think in his day and age it was seen as a more interesting kind of analogy. Whereas for us today, it's just lost its kind of verve to us. Yeah.
Within the context of the Space Trilogy.
Yeah. I'll put it this way. The criticism that I like the way you're putting it, that there's a tonal shift in the books. The answer is yes. And the answer is you can either read it charitably or not. Knowing you're going to not read it. No, I'm kidding. But I'm the same way. So that being said, I am the same way. I do think the book does do that. And what I do connect the book to is he wrote another book called The Pilgrim's Regress, which is sort of more of a pure allegory. It's not a very fun read. It's obtuse. It's too clever for its own good. It's really only probably funny for those who lived exactly in the Oxford context when he wrote it. And I do think that Hideous Strength it doesn't wear well over time. You ever, I would put it this way, you ever love a movie when you're a kid and you go back and watch it and you're like, this is awful. Like, why did I love this? There's no CGI? No. But you go back and you're like, what was so interesting about this? I think there are some books that are always timeless and sort of have they stand the test of time, put it that way. I think that Hideous Strength, at least that first chunk, has some challenges to it. I don't know if people necessarily will find it as riveting. I'm kind of prejudicing you for it, and maybe you will disagree and find it actually riveting. But you're not the first. In fact, every time I've taught on Lewis or the Space Trilogy, they always say, yeah, I like the first two. What was that third one? And it doesn't quite make much sense to them, at least the first half. So one of the last things I will say here is in that Hideous Strength, again, the concept is that, again, rationalistic materialism, and I like what you added before, Darwinianism to that. This kind of, the ways in which the modern world had become a religion are on full display in the second half of that Hideous Strength, when you start to see unfolding this process. Now, the one thing I will say about Lewis on this point is he really is, I find, among the first, if not the first, to describe the assumptions of the day as a religion, as sort of quasi-cultish. Now, you got to let that hit you a little bit harder when you read it, or when you at least reflect on it. I call it the Citizen Kane effect. Again, Citizen Kane is one of these movies that changed the way cinema is made. And you go back and you watch it, and you're like, Rosebud? I don't understand. It's a scooter. Like, what's the point of Rosebud? And the whole reality is, everything in that movie has become so obvious and so normal that we lose how revolutionary it was. I feel the same way about Lewis on this issue with rationalistic materialism. He is literally making it cult-like. It's diabolical. Now, in today's modern world, where we have really shrill atheists that are out there proclaiming in this kind of way and acting very cult-like, that makes kind of sense to us. But in Lewis's day, he is describing what is in most places, particularly at the Oxford level, is the default position of everybody. And he's treating them all like they're sort of cultish, diabolical folks. He's not pulling any punches. So what he's doing, in other words, is some real strident critiques of the world around him. But he's doing it in a way that, again, hopefully with the background lectures that we've given you, you have to see, this is the default position, yet he is not afraid to say, you guys are out of your mind. You think you have figured everything out rationally, when really you're acting diabolically. Lastly, and it goes back to the question that was raised earlier, the mythology pieces. The fact that he comments throughout the Space Trilogy on Venus, and he says, well, this is like the god of love, and there are some other classic pagan elements, and other things like that. I have people, when they read that, they go, what? This is strange. He's including seemingly pagan, not seemingly, clearly pagan things on the side of what's good. I think the key to understanding that is exactly what Jake raised, which is, what is Merlin and Arthur doing there? I think by the time he gets to the end of the trilogy, he goes almost full allegory. And he starts basically saying, materialistic atheism over there, and its reductionism, and all of the stuff that's mythopoeic, that doesn't succumb to that kind of weird stuff, the kind of rationalistic determinism, is going to be over here. In other words, I don't think I'm certain he's not saying, and by the way, there is a god named Venus, and therefore the Bible has embraced all faiths, and it's fully sort of pluralistic. But I mean, no one reads the Arthurian legend or Merlin in that kind of classic pagan way, right? I mean, by the 20th century, Merlin and the Round Table and Arthur is just this interesting template of a story that's retold. It's the same way Robin Hood is just retold and redone. And that, I think, gives us a signal literarily that what Lewis is saying is there is a whole world of the past that had, as Peter Berger once put, angels in the architecture. That there is a divinity in everything. And at least in the ancient world, the pagan world and the Christian world could agree on that. It was more of a fight as to whose God is real and whose God is king. But with the atheistic materialism, what has happened is they've denied all of this side of having any existence at all. And so what I think Lewis is doing in the end is he's saying this satanic attempt to sort of make all of us kind of pinched rationalists is a diabolical attempt that gets us out of this idea that it is a divinely inspired word with both good and evil at work at all times. So in other words, my read on it, I don't think Lewis is saying, hey, Aphrodite, pretty good god. No, what he's saying is that the ancient world, the medieval world, even the classical world, is better than this alternative that we have right now with modernism. Yeah, that's great. Let me explain what he means. He's talking about Numenor and these other bits. In that hideous strength, randomly, suddenly, Lewis refers to Numenor. Numenor, there we are. Now, he actually misspells it. He doesn't put the asterisk over it. That actually made Tolkien madder than anything. He didn't actually put the right language down. But Numenor is straight out of Lord of the Rings. And Lewis had read it, and by the time he gets to write that hideous strength, he includes a reference to it, which is kind of what I'm saying, which is he's including all mythopoeic stuff, even the made-up one that Tolkien has just come up with. And he's saying, this is a better alternative to these guys. mythopoeic, appreciation of literature, even pagan sources, better than atheistic materialism. That's where I do think there is. I do think. Put it this way: that hideous strength for me is sort of taking a nosedive, and at the end, it pulls up out of the nosedive and doesn't crash, because it actually becomes a key for reading the whole thing. What he's doing is he's saying, and again, notice the timing: 1945, when atheistic materialism is the very thing that is driving the Axis powers, in particular Germany. This idea that they will conquer and they will destroy. And the other piece of this as well is, now it's sometimes alleged wrongly that people in Britain were unaware of the Holocaust or the other atrocities going on. They knew all of it. We actually have letters of Lewis and Tolkien where they're talking about the atrocities that Hitler is inflicting on the Jewish population in Germany and throughout Europe. What Lewis is looking at is that very thing, and that's why the diabolical, the occult view of this atheistic materialism is so rampant. But what he ends up saying is, he goes, all of this, meaning basically all of the world that I love, the Inklings, classical literature, medieval literature, Renaissance literature, even Lord of the Rings literature, is at least in a better frame of reference in terms of worldview than what these guys are giving us. And so therefore he says, do not assume that this is the way you ought to go. It actually is detrimental. It actually is a significant problem. And as I say here at the end, it all comes down to the nature of evil. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. At times veiled, and at times unveiled and really scary. Yeah.
I mean, but it's kind of interesting, isn't it? You know?
Well, I like where you're going with that. I would personally say it differently of Tolkien in my own words. So I like what you're saying. Yes, in Lewis, and this might be some papers you're working on. But in Lewis, you have a almost always polar opposite light and dark, good and evil. It's always much more clear. It's always White Witch, Aslan. Nice, or in that Hideous Strength, or Weston in Perelandra, and Out of the Silent Planet, and then on the other side, the good forces. I wouldn't say Tolkien lacks that, but rather I would say Tolkien has a clear concept of good and evil, but literarily, I put it that way, he shades them to the point that those who are experiencing it sometimes do not understand what is in front of them. So, for example, the character of Sauron, the wizard. In the books, it is very clear he is inclining towards evil. There is some signs that there are problems afoot, but he is not the worst possible character. In other words, he's very good at sort of making it gray, put it that way. But then you have Gollum. I mean, Gollum is clearly twisted, clearly problematic. But then you have Boromir, who is he evil at the end? Is he evil when he's doing it? Well, in other words, Tolkien, I think, does a better job at putting us on the question of, is everything evil fully evil, and if it are all things that are, in other words, he shades the meanings in between.
It's like a duality type of thing.
Or he allows people to say there might be more than one answer here besides one way or the other. Now, I don't think they fundamentally disagree, Lewis and Tolkien, but I think their instincts as writers end up bringing out more differences. I do think the same is true with good as well. I think Tolkien has a more nuanced understanding of good. Sometimes good is Sam, who is self-sacrificing and completely humble. Sometimes it's Strider, who is a kick-butt, take-names, like King of Kings, sort of Christ. He sort of embodies Christ-like figures within him, or the figure within him. Or your Gandalf, who is wise and all those kinds of things. He has a kaleidoscope of different understandings of ways that you can be biblically good, put it that way.